Good morning, everyone. Welcome back. Looks like I'm looking through the chat here as we're starting, and it looks like it's sunny all over the place. So it's a nice day here too. So welcome. If you're new, I'm Shelley Pryor. I'm a watercolor artist in Ontario, Canada. And every Wednesday morning at 10 o'clock in the morning that's Eastern time, I do a live demonstration. So I'll do a watercolor today, and of course I'm always looking for something unique to do, and if you have any suggestions, by all means put them in the chat. So welcome everybody, and let's take a look at what we're going to work on today. So today what I thought I'd like to do is to give you a way of approaching the light that's streaming through trees. I'm using this reference picture just loosely, okay? I'm actually going to compose it a little bit to my own liking. I'm not, it's very organic. There's a lot of little bits and pieces. I'm not going to make it exactly the same, but I'm going to use it for the idea. So let's jump in here. I'm going to talk about what I'm going to be using first. I'll be using Arches 140-pound cold pressed paper, which is 100% cotton paper. And mostly I'm using Da Vinci watercolors here. And I'm going to be using an assortment of brushes. I'm going to be using a few natural hair brushes. And but I'm also going to be using a couple of synthetic brushes, and these ones don't need to be in good shape or anything like that. These are just little old synthetic brushes that I've used for acrylics and things like that, but they're still soft enough, but they're not natural hair, so they spring back a little bit. That's what I'm looking for, is a brush that will spring back. I'm going to be using a spray bottle. I'm also going to be using some masking fluid. So I'm going to start off with maybe just a very, just to make it a little easier to understand, I'm going to start with a little light sketch. But I wouldn't necessarily start with a sketch on my own. I would start by painting directly on the paper with sort of a mental idea of what I wanted to do. But since you can't read my mind, I'm going to do a sketch. So my sketch is going to be very, very loose. Here we go. Just nothing fancy. This is just a mechanical pencil. And I know that I need my sun in this area here, somewhere in there. And in fact, I think I might even want to move it a little bit off to the side. Maybe I'll move it a little bit more to the right. All right, so this is going to be my light source here. I'm going to have a tree through here, something like that. Another kind of gnarly tree right through here. And my horizon is down around here somewhere. Now, I think that horizon's just maybe a little too straight, so I'm going to just make it a little bit more interesting and put it on a slight angle, maybe a hill. And maybe even another hill like that. Hopefully you can see that. That's my drawing. That's as simple as I'm going to make it. Now, I'm going to start off, of course, but there's a lot of light here. We need to preserve the light. And I'm going to begin with using some masking fluid. So for my masking fluid, I'm going to use a brush that is dedicated just to masking. And so it's not a fancy brush by any means, but I'm going to put soap on it because that's going to, this is just ordinary hand soap. It's nothing fancy, just what you wash your hands with. And I'm going to coat my bristles. And by coating my bristles, that makes the masking fluid not cling to the bristles and ruin them. So I don't want to dip my brush, like there's not very much masking fluid in here, like it's way down here now, and I'm not going to dip my brush in there and get all my brush handle messy, so I'm going to pour a little bit into a little container. There we go, and I'll wipe that off. and replace the lid. That keeps this fresher longer if I can keep the lid on as much as possible. And then I'm only working with this little bit in my cup. So of course I need to preserve the sun. What else do I need to preserve? Lots and lots of little holes in the trees. So I'm just going to dabble in a whole lot of little blobs, basically, throughout these trees. And I don't want to make them polka dots. Maybe I can even zoom in a little bit and you can see a little closer what I'm doing here. But I don't want to make them polka dots. And so to do this, I'm making sure that I sort of press down on the brush and get different shapes and sizes. Don't work in rows or anything like that. I don't want to make a wallpaper pattern. No organized thing here, but I want to see a lot of light coming through these trees. And I'm not worrying about the really, really tiny ones so much, but some of the bigger areas I really want to try and get in there. So a few small ones, of course, but it's more the slightly larger sizes that I want to get in there. And even down through here a little bit. Oh, one other thing I'm going to be using in this, I'm going to use some salt. Salt is a wonderful way to create texture in trees and grasses and all kinds of things. So there's going to be a little bit of wait time here, a little bit of drying time that we'll have to endure. But all right, so leave spaces where there's not masking. I think it's important to have sort of denser areas within the trees as well. And that's just going to give me a bunch of holes through the trees. Now, why am I doing this? Well, if I had to paint around all of those, it would take me a long time. Then I get a whole lot of hard edges, and I know that the masking fluid is going to give me some hard edges too. But I will have a solution for that. Hopefully. Okay, I think that's enough. That's going to take a couple of minutes to dry. And while that's drying, we can think about mixing up some colors. Okay, so this brush, I didn't clean it out that well the last time, and so it's got a little bit of a, it's got a bit of masking fluid stuck in it. So this is a product called Goo Gone. It's for removing sticky labels from glassware that you buy in the store and things like that. And if I just sort of put my brush in there a little bit, I can get that dried up masking fluid out of here. I just have to work it in there. I'm trying not to submerge the entire ferrule because, of course, that's what's holding the bristles into the brush, the glue in there. And so I'm just massaging it a little bit, spreading out the bristles, and then I'll wipe that off. Massage it some more, and I can get this brush back with all the masking fluid out of it. This is kind of a citrus, I think, citrus solution. It smells very kind of lemony. So anyway, so now that's fine now. I can use that for another masking, and it's going to be great. All right, so yeah, we're going to mix up some color. So I'm going to take a fairly large brush here, about the size of my thumb, And I want to mix up some really nice light colors. This photograph is predominantly green. This could be early spring. I forget when I took this, but it could be early spring. And I could use a pre-mixed green here, like this leaf green, but I could easily mix a green like that with nice cool yellow, little cobalt blue, and I can mix almost the very same thing. You see, those two colors are virtually the same, so I could just mix a big puddle. But since I have it already mixed, it's called leaf green, and I already have it. I might as well use it up since I have it. I'm going to use some of that. And I want to use some darker greens as well. So for my darker green, I can take a little of this leaf green, put some Payne's gray into it, and I can make a darker green. And they better be a little bit different, because if they're not different enough, you won't get quite the same effect. So, a couple of first timers here. I'm reading through the chat, and welcome. Yeah, I don't see any questions so far, so I'll keep looking for questions. And I might suggest that if you have a question, put it in capitals. It'll be easier for me to find it. And, because sometimes when I'm sort of skimming the chat, I can easily miss a question. I don't like to, so I'm going to use a lot of this sort of leafy green. I might even, I want to put something warm in there though, because these are both kind of cool colors. And so I'm going to put in maybe a little bit of quinacridone gold. Quinacridone gold is a really nice sort of warm golden color. It's very transparent. I like that. And my masking fluid still isn't dry. I can see by the, you see there's some shine on there? See those shiny spots? That tells me it's not dry. It'll turn a little darker once it's dry. I can't really speed it up with masking fluid. Or with a hairdryer, I mean, masking fluid you shouldn't dry with a hairdryer. Just let it dry naturally, it's much better. But here's the plan. I'm going to take and put in some of my colors through here, but I'll maybe just talk about how I'm going to go about applying some of these colors that I've mixed up here. I'm going to grab a scrap. Let me just grab something. Okay, so I'm going to take some just scrap paper here and bring this over onto here. And I want to talk a little bit about how I'm going to apply this color. I want to do this while it's pretty wet. While the paint's pretty wet, I need to work fairly quickly. So as I apply color, I'm using a nice soft brush, not pressing. The one thing I see that's sort of a common trouble that beginners have is that they, especially if they've worked in acrylic or something like that, is that they will tend to push the paint around rather than just touching the paper. With watercolor, you just touch the paper and it releases the color. So I'm going to sort of skip around. I might even make a few more little holes through here as I'm doing this. But then I'm going to switch to another color. And you can see that by switching to another color, but they're the same consistency, both really watery, I can really make that move. And if I tip and tilt this, I can get even more. I can get even more blending, that is. So I can work through here. And this is why I wanted to preserve some of this, because I want to work really wet and I don't want to lose all of those spaces in the trees. What masking fluid brand am I using? I am using Winsor Newton. This one is Winsor Newton. This is a really old bottle. You can tell it's the old style bottle, the one that you can still get the cap off. Yeah, that's the one I'm using today. there's lots of good brands. You know, there's Winsor Newton's good, PBO's good. We have a brand here called Demco Artist Series, and that's good as well. They're all they're mostly good. It's just as long as you use them while they're still fluid. They have a very short shelf life, masking fluids. So if you think that your masking fluid's not a good brand, it could be a fine brand. It could be just that it's old. It's one thing about masking fluid is it will just have a short shelf life. All right, so in this, I'm going to take some of this Quin Gold and I'm going to drop some of that in. And it's wet too, and I can just sort of tilt that around. And now I have this sort of warm area within my tree. Right. I'll do this again when I actually do when my masking fluid's dry. There'll be areas that will be preserved by masking. Some of these I did with, you know, just by painting around shapes and things like that. But putting the masking fluid on will give you some really nice organic type shapes. And I'm going to try to do this in as few layers as possible, just because of the amount of dry time and everything. But just dry this. Letting it dry naturally is actually the best, but I need to set this aside, so I'm just going to dry this. When it loses a little bit of that shine, let me show you the shine on here. Do you see that it's this part here that's really wet? You can see that's really glossy. Now look at this shine. That's satiny shine. Okay, this is glossy. This is still pretty glossy over here. But this is satin, right? When it gets to that satin stage, that's the perfect time to put salt on if that's what you're planning to do. So let's take a little, sprinkle a little on. If you put it on too wet, the granules of salt just soak up all that extra moisture, and then the effect, it can't create the effect, because the effect of the salt is that it absorbs what's around it, and if it's fully saturated, it can't take anymore, and then you don't get that nice salty effect. So the timing of the application for salt is kind of important, and I'll just set that aside. I might have been a little late on that one, but we'll see. We'll see what happens with that. It's just a test, so it's not a big deal. Now, now I see I still have a little masking fluid that's wet, so I'm going to have to let that dry. But I can talk a little bit about creating trees and tree branches. And so trees and tree branches, if you have something like a rigger brush, it's very helpful. But you can easily do this with just your standard round brush too, right? This is a round number 10 brush. And if I were to fill this up with a color, I'll just use a Payne's Gray for this. Make sure you've filled up your brush. And again, with the light touch, you don't have to press really hard. The stuff that I used to clean the masking fluid out of my brush is called Goo Gone, Googone. And it is, I'm sure that they make other companies make something similar. It's for basically the products that you would use to remove gummy labels. Like when you see a residue after you take off a price tag off of something, or you know, one of those, any kind of a tag off of something that leaves its gummy residue, it's designed for taking that off. And that's the product that you would use. So with my brush full of color, I can I want you to think of branches almost like lightning bolts. They're not smooth like this, right? They're jaggedy and natural. And as I lift my brush, the branches get smaller, but they're all a little bit jaggedy. And the other thing is that the branches don't come off the tree all in the same direction. And depending on the kind of tree, they quite often will, the weight of the branch pulls it down from the trunk, but then the ends of the branches reach up towards the sun. And that's often the case. And branches will also crisscross. They'll do a lot of crisscross. Remember, the tree is round, so the branches will come towards you, they will go away from you, all that sort of thing. And sometimes they just almost go straight up because of the way that the perspective, the branches are coming towards you, and that sort of thing. So while this is going on, I can also dabble in some greenery, because this is not winter. Those branches aren't necessarily bare. I can even splash in. Oh, I better be careful here. But if I were to take some color, I could splash that in. That sort of thing, and I can splash some of that in, and all of that makes it look organic, natural. If you do everything with your brush, it can often look very contrived, not as natural. So that's something to keep in mind. And I think we are okay. I don't have any residue left in my fingers, so I think we're okay to get going here with our wash. So I want you to think of the first layer as a wash. I'm going to leave, you can see in this picture that my sky is pretty much white, and I'm just going to leave it white. So let me zoom out again. And I'm going to come in and closest to the sun, I want to put something that is a little bit warm. Typically the sun is a warm color, will produce a warm color. So that's where this quinacridone gold comes in. All right, so I'm going to come in with this light green, and I'm going to dabble a lot of this in. I'll leave a few gaps as well of my own. I did use the masking fluid, and then when I come down into here, I'm going to really start spreading things out. When I say spreading things out, that means I'm very, very lightly touching the paper with the side of my bristles rather than the point of my bristles. Okay, so let's take a look here. We've got these, I have these natural looking branches, so I'm just kind of dabbling through here to make a whole sort of natural thing, and then I will start coming down into here. And if I need some help keeping things wet, I can always use a spray bottle. So as I come through here, I can get up on the tiptoe and just sort of dance and play with my brush here to make a little bit more of a natural looking branch. So you hold your brush on the end, then you won't have that sort of death grip, tight control over things. All right, now as we start getting further away, I'm going to start coming in with some darker greens, and I can dabble in a little bit within here as well, but mostly I'm just going to go to a larger wash and start getting a little darker as I get away from the sun. Spray bottle handy. And when I spritz something, look how I'm holding it up near my face, right? You can see this up in the top left-hand corner there. I'm holding it way far away, and I'm spraying it out, and it's falling on my paper. And that's going to keep things a little bit wetter for me. But before this area begins to dry, I want to put in some of this quinacridone gold. Just touch it into some of that color, and it will sort of melt and warm up that little area there. But this paint is, I want all of this nice and transparent. I don't want to have like really dark, thick paint in there, nothing opaque. I mean, we're trying to convey light, so we need to have the feeling of some light in there. So I've got this warm color, then we've got this nice light green color, and we're slowly getting darker. So I've got to move a little faster here because this is going to begin to dry. Now, as we get further to the ground, things start to fill in a little bit more densely, and I'm really getting my brush full. And there's a lot of that sort of nice light golden green on the ground as well. So I'm going to take some of that light green in some of these areas and put some of that through here too. Mostly in front of, like in the front of the sun there. This is much looser than I typically paint, as you know. My landscapes do tend to be a lot looser. But I'm working like a fiend here to try to get as much of this on here nice and wet before this dries. All right, so I'm going to mix up a little bit more of this green, this darker green here, because what I want to do is create the illusion of a little bit more sort of darkness through the trees here. And don't forget, you can also splash a little bit. Let's take some of this light green here. I'm going to splash some of that on there. Just helps add to the atmosphere. All right, so coming in with this nice green, and I want you to remember something. As you work, the paper starts to dry. So make sure you're not coming in on drying paper and suddenly putting in a bunch of wet color. That's where you're going to get a lot of blossoms. So I'm really working fast in order to keep this all wet at the same time. I would maybe try it on something smaller just to see what you can manage before trying it on like a really big sheet kind of thing. But see here, this was a little wetter, right? So if something like that happens, spray bottle to the rescue. Help keep it a little bit wetter. And I'm going to give the illusion of some of the light hitting the grasses in the foreground here. So I'm going to put a few darks in through here. Some of my darker green. And I could actually take my brush and sort of drag through to make sunbeams. But honestly, I don't like how the paper looks after I've done that. So I like to, if I can do it another way, that's what I'll do. I'm getting a puddle here, so I'm drinking that up. And what I want to create now is, and I need to make sure that my puddle's not wetter than my paper. So to make sure that my puddle's not wetter than my paper, I'm going to blot my brush. And here's where I'm going to come in, and rather than painting the sunbeams lighter, I'm going to paint the spaces between the sunbeams. So that's my aim here. And everything aims right at this spot here, which is going to be the sun. think I'd like to maybe put a few more trees on top of that, but and see, that creates the look of the sunbeams, and the sunbeams get wider the further away from the sun they get. I blot it so that I have a little control. Okay, so I can do a little lifting as long as I don't scrub that paper too much. So I can drink up a little bit if I need to. Okay, so that gives me some sunbeams. I like that. And I want to put a little bit more around this sun. I'm blotting it just because I feel like that paper is a little dry. So just dabble in a little bit more there. Okay. So already I have some atmosphere established. How do I pre-stretch my paper before painting? Sure, I'm happy to share that. I just take my paper and I put it in my sink. If it's too big for my sink, I just take a big wet sponge and wet it on my table. But basically I'm soaking it for 3 minutes, just room temperature. I quickly pull it out and staple it onto a board. And the easiest way I have found to staple it onto a board is to take my staple gun. Let me grab it. It's actually not a staple gun. It's a standard stapler. And I hold it with this part hanging off of my table. And I run my finger along here like this. So I find the spacing and I staple, and my finger guides the stapler so all my staples end up in a straight line. Then I turn the painting and I figure out the distance, and once again, with this hanging off the edge of my table, I staple it again. And I'm stapling onto a board that's soft and firm, but soft enough to take these staples. This is just a regular office stapler. So I would put in about one staple per inch, and with the softer board means they're easy to put in, but more importantly, they're easier to take out. So I like to use a regular stapler. Those heavy-duty staplers, I even bought an electric one thinking, okay, that'll make it easier, and it really didn't make it easier because I still had to push down really hard on it. And they're not as easy to take out. So I'm using something called Gator board. This is not the easiest thing to find for some reason. I got mine from Uline. That's a company, I think that's all over the US as well. But we have one locally and I go up there and I buy it. But you have to buy a lot. You have to buy like 3 sheets of 4 foot by 8 foot. So it's like buying a piece of drywall. So you need a big vehicle to pick it up, or you have to sit in the parking lot like I did and cut it in half. So, or you can buy the smaller size too. You can buy 32 by 40 or something. I forget what it is, but you can buy a half size or something like that. Is there a difference between glazing and layering? I guess it's a little bit of both, a little bit of terminology as well as, and there is a slight difference, I think. The glazing would be going over another color, perhaps, maybe just in a simple small area. Whereas layering, I kind of think of that as like the whole picture. But that's just my interpretation. That I don't think that's any, I don't think it's written down anywhere. When the painting is finished, do you cut the painting so you don't get the staple marks? I actually leave the staple marks on. They're getting hidden by the matting anyway, and that's the indication that the person who buys it has the original, and I leave them on. You know what's easy? I know, as having done a lot of framing, I know that that's actually easier for the framer to have a little bit more paper than the opening. When people cut the picture so close to the opening size, that can sometimes be a little bit problematic in painting, or in framing. But anyway, so this is starting to dry, but I'm going to help it now. The shine is gone. Most of the shine is gone. It's a little bit shiny at the bottom, but I'm going to help dry this. I have to be careful with my masking fluid because this is a heat gun, and I don't want to bake that on. So I have to keep this moving. So I'm just going to come in and try and speed things up a little bit here. Normally, if I'm on my own, I would just grab another piece of paper and work on another one to keep myself from playing with it when I shouldn't. But I want to make sure that this layer is good and dry before I come and do the next one. And guess what I didn't do? I didn't do the salt. Oh well. I'll have to do that on another layer. I know it's best when it's done on the first, but I can do a little bit now too, on a second layer. Sometimes I lose my train of thought, trying to work the technology, answer the questions, paint, talk. So sometimes I forget stuff, but not the end of the world. But the thing is, I wouldn't want to touch this while it's anywhere near sort of half dry. That's when you want to stop, dry it fully before attempting anything else. And you'll know it's fully dry when the paper gets flat again, right? It feels dry, but it's nice and warm at the moment with this tool. But I know that there's probably some drier areas. I wouldn't even mind seeing a little bit more pronounced sunbeams. How do I cut gator board? That's one of the questions that just came up. Carol, I cut my gator board. It's not the easiest stuff to cut, to be honest. I use a utility knife. You need to make sure it's good and sharp. A ruler, and I will cut, and you have to score it quite a few times because this outer core, like the outer crust of the gator board. Let me show it on the end. It's like this on both sides. It's very hard veneer, and it takes a bit of doing to cut through it. So this is 3/4 inch that I'm using, and I would cut a few times to get, and you can feel when you hit the foam, it's like all of a sudden it gives away. So I don't really even have to worry too much about getting through the foam, but I do cut into the foam some. Then I turn it over and I cut on the opposite side in the same place. That's the tricky part. You have to make sure that you're cutting in the same place on both sides, and then it will snap. Once you've cut through that hard veneer on both sides, then you can snap it, and it will break very easily. But it does take, it's a bit of work to cut this stuff. You can also use it like a table saw or something like that, but it does tend to chip the edges of this a little bit if you're using a table saw. It makes them a little bit rough, so you might have to sand it or something like that afterwards. But I get nice clean cuts with with the utility knife, it will give me a nice clean cut and pretty darn straight. So I've had pretty good success doing that, but I find it really hard on my hands. But thanks, Linda. Linda's forgiving me for all the juggling I do. It's kind of like that guy on Ed Sullivan that had all the plates spinning on all the sticks all at the same time. All right, so I'm letting this cool down. That's why I'm kind of yakking here for a second. And I'm going to re-wet this. I'm going to strengthen some of my shadows in here. And now, since I can't really get all of this in the exact same place that I got it before, I mean, let's face it, if I had to hit every one of those little bits in the same place, I'd go crazy. So I'm just going to use a spray bottle to wet this time. I'm going to use some of my same color, so I'm going to mix up a little bit more, make sure I've got plenty. A bunch of my green just dripped into my yellow, so there we go. Get some of that in there. And some more of my dark. Ooh, that's really dark. All right. So, spray bottle, but not like this. That's too close. I need to hold it back here where you can't even see it on the screen. I'm going to spritz it. It's not even too essential that this be like uniform coverage. I mean, it's kind of coming out like little droplets anyway, but I'm getting it good and wet without disturbing anything that's there. Okay. So I can come in and mostly with this dark, I guess. I don't really need to add light, but mostly with dark. Let's see what it's going to do on the paper. That's pretty good. So I can come in with my sunbeams and make them a little stronger. Look how they taper towards the sun. That's important that they taper like that. It doesn't matter which direction you go. You can go both ways. But this will definitely make the sun look more pronounced. The feeling of sun. I don't want to make it too even. I like it a little bit asymmetrical. So I'm going to put some of that in there. Might even drop in a little bit more in the foreground here. Just, you know, just the idea of some plants and stuff. Grasses or whatnot. Put some of that in. Nice and loose. Ooh, don't want to make too many stripes there. All right, so now we have much stronger feeling of sunshine. And I find this is a little too even looking, so let's break this up. There, break that up, put another sunbeam in there. So you can't follow your photo to a T. I mean, all you can do is get the feeling from it, and that's what I'm trying to duplicate here, is the feeling. So I'm wiping my tape off. As the paper starts to lose a bit of its bright shine, I can see a hard line here, so let's get my spray bottle, take care of that. And see, that now softens. I don't want any hard edges in here. This is my sort of my first layers of getting things really soft. I like the feeling of that sort of light just streaming through all of that. Now, I'm looking at the shine. If I put my salt on right now, it might be a little bit too early, but it looks wetter over here than it does here. So I'm going to start off by putting a little bit of the table salt, just normal table salt. And I wouldn't put it evenly through, like don't try to sprinkle it evenly. You know, there's going to be pockets where there's going to be more. Put a little bit here too. But I'd say more in this foreground. And we'll see what that does. Just trying to figure out what to do with the rest of that salt. So it's gone in the garbage. Yeah, so we'll watch what happens there. See, I told you that this was wetter. Look how dark the granules of salt got right in that spot. They got darker because it was so wet. They're saturated now. So I can probably get my salt effect if I wait for that shine to come down a little bit. Just bringing my brush along there to keep that sunbeam there. And I'll try a little more salt. Eventually, if I waited long enough, that salt won't do anything. So the timing's pretty important. And if you use bigger salt, you'll get a bigger effect. Like it won't be as delicate as, say, the regular granulated salt for the table. So now we cannot use a blow dryer on this because the salt needs time to absorb. If we dry it, we dry the salt, then the salt can't do its thing. So let's wait for paint to dry. This is a good time for me to answer any questions. Negative painting sunbeams, brilliant. Thank you. Yeah, lifting out the sunbeams tends to make them look a little bit, like it kind of roughs up the paper a little bit, I find. It doesn't give as much sort of clean, fresh color in those beams of light. So I do like that a little bit better than lifting out. So, but the salt is beginning, you can see the salt starting to do its thing. Boy, I put a lot, kind of put more on there maybe than I intended, but that's okay. I don't mind that at all. It kind of, you know, when you have dust particles in the air and you get all this sort of sprinkling of sort of light hitting granules of dust, gives that kind of a look too. But while we're waiting for that to dry, there is something I can do. This is where the synthetic brushes are going to come in, because the synthetic brushes are going to allow me to soften up some of these edges. So for this, I'm going to use this is really small. You can see compared to my finger how small that is. It's just a little old worn out brush. This is a 1/8 inch brush by Low Cornell. You can't buy it anymore because Low Cornell is not making brushes, or that company doesn't exist anymore. And so I'm going to just dampen my brush. And what I want to do is I want to soften edges. Because the one thing about sun coming through the trees and stuff is that it makes all of those edges very fuzzy. So from the light area, you push into the color and you can soften up edges. So the idea here is I want to make as much fuzziness as I can. Now I'm going to soften up the ones that I did that I kind of painted around. But when I take off the masking fluid, I'm going to have to do more of this. So just working away here to get things very soft looking. But it's going to, because the paper is a little bit damp at the moment, it's tending to run the color a little bit more. So I'm going to do some of them, but I'm not going to try to complete all of this until things are a little drier. When the salt has pretty much done its thing, and I could actually splatter a little bit into here too. if I took this, I can take a little fan brush. I like to spatter with a fan brush. I could spatter a little bit in here, and that will make a little bit of texture and things like that too. You can really have a lot of fun with this. But I'd have to go a little darker, I think. There. Just a little bit. Sometimes less is more. You can go a little too crazy with some of these techniques. So I'm just going to keep working at a few edges while this gets dry enough that I can take a hairdryer to it. So when you're softening an edge, always start in the clean area, the whiter area, and work towards the paint. If you go the opposite way and you try to push outward, like sort of spread out the color, you'll end up with a new hard edge. So lots of fuzzy, soft edges. That's a real benefit to creating the effect. Okay, I think my salt's done all I want it to do, and I'm going to just take the dryer to this now. I'm going to do more lifting in a minute. Keep it moving. Because after this layer, what I want to do is take off all of the salt, and I want to take off the masking fluid. Did I use a slightly dry or mostly dry, or a damp brush for softening? Not too wet. And dry paper towel. If you're wiping off the excess onto your paper towel, and you have to keep rinsing your brush as you're softening edges, because if you don't rinse it off, you're picking up color and just moving it around. Paper's getting flatter. Wiping my tape because things always stay wet longer on the tape than they do elsewhere. All right, so we've got some nice salt effects. Where it was wetter, you can see the effect is larger than where it was smaller. So I'm going to, I'm just going to take a little card. I'll take a rewards card. We'll just take a rewards card here, and I'm going to scrape off my salt, just very gently, not trying to damage the paper, but it's a little easier to take the salt off this way. You can also use a palette knife. It does a good job of removing the salt, but now there's no salt here. Anything that's left you can brush off with your hand. I still feel a little dampness in my paper, so I'm going to dry this just a little bit more before I attempt to remove masking fluid. So just get my salt in the garbage here instead of on my floor. And just going to dry it a little bit more. Just I feel the dampness with the back of my hand. I can feel the dampness. A damp brush, I'm going to be doing more of that, so I will explain that I'm using just a slightly damp brush for softening edges. With the paint being really fresh, like, you know, it's new paint, I just put it down, it should lift pretty easily. You could also treat your paper with lifting preparation, I should say. So you can brush some lifting preparation on there, and sometimes that makes it a little bit easier to soften edges. Okay, so it's still a little warm, but I'm going to use my rubber cement pickup eraser to remove my masking fluid. If you don't have this is like a little crepe tool. Sorry, it looks a little beat up and it's well loved, as you can tell. But if you don't have one of these, masking tape has a sticky side, and the sticky side sticks really well to the masking and removes it very easily. So you can wrap it with the sticky side out around your finger and so on. So I'm coming through here now and removing my masking, always pulling my masking in one direction. That's where the sun is, bursting through there. Let's remove some of that. So I've removed my masking now, but those are a little bit harsh looking, as you can tell. So this is where I'm going to take this little brush, dip it into my water, blot it on my paper towel, and I want to come in, let me zoom in a little closer here. And I just want to work on edges. So I've got my dry paper towel here, my clean paper towel, and I start where it's clean and I push in towards the color. I don't want to work this way and push it into the light area. I'm always pushing it away from the light area. And I've rinsed, I keep putting my brush in my water container, but then blotting it off. So I should be able to soften up some of these edges. And blot with my paper towel. Around the sun, that's where I really want to make sure that I've got some nice glow here. And I can spray the paper. If I sprayed the paper, that helps to prevent those rings. And if you've ever tried to lift anything, you know what I'm talking about. The rings, when you try to lift, sometimes you make a new ring. And having the paper a little bit damp will help with that. All right, so I'm getting this nice sort of glow around the sun. A synthetic brush is much better for this because, of course, you're doing a bit of scrubbing. You need a little bit more strength in the bristles. Don't use your nice Kolinsky brushes or your Escodas or anything like that to do this kind of thing. But I really want to try to get the glowiness, if you will, of these areas. And I'll do an area, I'll do one section, and you'll see the difference between where I've sort of lightened it and made it look like it's bursting with light, as opposed to these other areas that look like they're kind of cut out confetti. So I'm lifting this out. Sorry, my hand's probably in the way there. As I said, lifting preparation, or even a little gum arabic in your paint. Gum arabic is this product here, gum arabic. That can also, sorry, I put it closer to the table where it's in focus. The gum arabic can also make it a little easier to lift your paint, but you have to be careful how much you add into your color, because too much can make your paint shiny, which is not good. We'll lift some of these ones down here too. This little brush is really roughed up. I use it for a lot of, I never throw brushes out because these brushes actually come in pretty useful sometimes. These messed up brushes. I have a whole collection of messed up brushes. Sometimes I have to work at it a little bit, but I think it's worth it. You really don't need to do every single one, but at least do some of the larger ones, the larger areas. Let's move this over a little bit. Harder edges can be softened with a little persistence. They don't have to be completely, you know, no hard edge at all. I mean, I'm definitely softening, or at least lightening the paint around those openings, right? But look how this feels like it glows. And this one looks like a piece of white paper that I dropped on the paper. Oh, thank you. Yes, I have, actually have over 100 now, I think, of these live YouTubes. I started these during the pandemic when I was locked in, when I was in confinement, and I wanted to stay in touch with all my painting friends and my students and stuff, so I started doing these online so that they wouldn't let their brushes dry out and gather dust. My salt effect, by the way, would have been much more pronounced if I had done it on my first layer. I should mention that. Oh, Janet, you're so thoughtful. Thank you. So I'm going to continue just working around some of these. Maybe I won't, you know, because this could take a little bit of time to do. I don't want to spend all my time just doing just this. I'll move on, and we'll start putting in some of our main trees. Just want to do a little bit more over here. This glowy effect. One thing about things that glow is that they always have these sort of fuzzy edges. Lots of, often it's wet on wet technique, but in this case it's lifting. because the areas are so small. If I tried to do this wet on wet, these could very easily just fill right in or look a little bit too soft. I want specific shapes, but I want them to be fuzzy on the edges. All right, let's zoom out. So you can see that feels a lot more like the sun is glowing through there, right? If I left it hard, it wouldn't look as correct. So I'm going to be working now on dry paper, so I want to dry this so that I don't have patches that are a little wet and patches that aren't. So I'm just going to quickly dry this. If I see some spaces later on, I can always soften them. Oh, thank you so much. I know a lot of you come every week, and I really appreciate it. I really do. I mean, I wouldn't be here if you didn't come. So, I really do thank you for giving up your part of your day to be with me. All right. So, you can see that little bit of Quin Gold that I put in there has warmed up. So if I'd made this all just green, it wouldn't feel as sunny as it does with that warmth through there. It tells you kind of where the sun is. So now I'm going to come in and start putting in my trees. So my trees, as you can see in this picture, they're pretty dark, as are the grasses in the foreground. I could probably put in a few grasses and things like that. But as I do my trees, I want you to remember one thing. The trees are on the ground. So when you get to the bottom of a tree, I want you to connect it to the ground. I see it so often. People put a tree and it's just kind of like, I don't know, it's like a piece of wood just standing on end in the ground, and it really does become part of the ground. The roots always sort of spread out a little bit at the bottom and connect to the ground. So as I'm painting this, I'm going to negative paint around a few things. So I'm going to use mostly Payne's Gray for this, but I'm going to green it up a little bit. And I'm going to fill up my brush, right? This is a round brush. I've filled it up. And I'm going to do some of the trees in the background. So as I come to the ground, let's talk about the ground there. So that's the ground, and it connects to a tree. And I'm going to come in and put in some of these branches. And so I want this to connect, but I also want it to soften because that looks like it's just sitting, floating in the air. So let's connect this with a blotted brush. That's a wet brush here, fairly wet. And I'm connecting it and letting that sort of fade away like that. Where the light comes through, I'm just going to touch my brush. Don't pull your brush through. Just touch it there and blot it. And that will lighten that area. I don't want to rough up my paper at all. I just know that there's a sunbeam there, so I'm laying my damp brush right there and blotting it, and that pulls out some of that color where that sunbeam is. I can create more if I want to. You know, I can create the feeling of more, but I want to get a little bit more in here. Now, I'm going to use a lot of the side of my brush for some of this. Let's blot it and try to create a little bit of texture through here. But I want to get more branches established first. And I'm really using the tip toe of my brush here for this. And remember, the branches don't always come out at the same angle. And they're not naked trees, so I'm going to put in lots of foliage and that sort of thing as well. the hint of more trees back in here. These ones will just look like they're a little further away because they're not as they're not going to be as dark as my main trees around the sun. You know, when you get the sun right behind a tree, it's going to look extra dark because it is silhouetted by the sun. And as I get closer to the sun, my tree will take on some of this golden light. So let me get over there and I'll show you what I mean by that. Lots of dabbles. You know, you can always spatter too. So spattering gives it a little bit more of a natural look. Let's lighten up some of these as we come in. A little closer to the sun, we can lighten things up a little bit. But and there again, I'm in that sunbeam, right? So I'm going to take my brush, rinse it, blot it. I don't want it really wet, but I'll blot it, touch it to the spot, and blot it with my paper towel. Just touch it and blot it. And that pulls up just enough of that color. You can still see the line that I put down, but it just lightens it up a little bit. Let's grab some more fresh paper towel because that one's getting pretty wet. And I want to show you what's going to happen in this area right here. Even though in the picture we see that as really dark, I want to put in some of this quinacridone gold close to this area because that's going to convey the light a little bit more. And when I say convey, I mean that it, you know, it's going to feel like the light is there, as opposed to what we see in the picture where it's really like a photograph will just darken that. But if we're actually seeing it in the light in person, you're probably going to see something more golden right here. So if I come in with a few branches there, maybe some leaves that are in that color, and then I'm going to take some green and connect it that sort of thing, so that I get some golds up in here closer to the sun. That's what's going to make it feel really sunny. Try not to make this too see-through. Foliage. I'm going to do another branch here that's a little bit more golden. Connect it while it's wet, if you can, to the rest of the tree, and then the tree gets quite a bit darker. So and of course that tree has to connect to the ground. See how I made that? I deliberately made that trunk really kind of, what do you call it, irregular. Soften it, connect it to the ground and soften, right? It gives you that feeling of, you know, that this is ground, that the tree's not just floating in the air. I'm going to bring some of that down a little bit more. And I don't have to lift every sunbeam out, by the way. I can leave some of them in there, like I can leave some of these areas dark in the tree, but let's lift out a little bit right here. Just touch the brush, blot, rinse it, blot. If you swipe, you'll pull that dark color into your sunbeam. So just dampening it is a safer way to go. There, you get the feeling of the light coming through there. And this tree, because it's the main tree, is actually going to have a fair bit of dark in it. So I'm going to come in now with some almost Payne's gray, just to create the illusion of these tree being really silhouetted. Let's see here, get a little bit more foliage going on here, but we need more branches. A couple of dark branches in here too will give you the illusion that we're seeing the silhouette. The sunbeam isn't hitting some of those spots, and we're getting some of the darker tree there. But some of this with that orange color, that reddish color in there, can be very helpful. Let's put in some more trees in the background here, just a bunch more trunks. Should look more at my picture really, but hold the brush there for a minute if you want to get the feeling of that sunbeam, because it takes a minute to soften the paint on the paper. Yes, Paige. I do have quite a few of workshops that are on my website. They are longer, more extensive than what I can offer in an hour and a half on Wednesday morning. Now, some of these areas in here, I want to create the look of some of these grasses being in the foreground. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to negative paint around some of them. So I'm going to bring a few lines down into here, and the effect is going to be that there's some grasses through there. So I'm painting around grasses, if you will. Connecting all that. I can also bring in a few grasses in the foreground if I want to. And some of that texture still shows through there, and I can get some really nice effects. Now these ones I don't want to have too much contrast here, so I might blot them a little bit so that they're not too contrasty. This is where I want the most contrast, right where my main tree is. So that's where it's going to be mostly mostly really dark there. And I like these gnarly trees even better than a straight perfect tree. I think they have way more character. Okay, so I'm going to sort of continue that sort of hill going downhill a little bit. Just take my brush, my damp brush, lay it down in front, let that color run. How you paint your trees is kind of like your signature. They're all going to be a little bit different, your own interpretation. It's, you know, your brush mark making and that sort of thing gives you a little bit of that. Yeah, patience is something you need to have if you're painting in watercolor. If you push it when it's trying to dry, you're going to get into trouble. Now there's lots of foliage going on in here, so I have to dabble in a lot. Let's spatter it a little bit more too. This is mostly Payne's Gray that I'm using right in here. I really want to have more contrast in this section here. With the light behind, the contrast is going to be greater. So I'm going to imply some of the hill behind. Let's put a little hill in there. I'm going to soften some of that, some of it, not all of it. Some of that I will soften. The ones that aren't softened will look like grasses. Now let's connect some trees to that. And these trees do not need to be as strong as my main focus. They can be lighter. Get really up on the tiptoe if you want finer lines, and find what brush works best for you for making foliage. For some people it's like, some people like a dagger brush, some people like a script liner, whatever works best for you. But just remember that tree branches are usually kind of like little lightning bolts. They're sort of zigzaggy and irregular. And they come out from the tree, sometimes up and sometimes down. There's so much variety in there. Let's get this a little more green. As we get it further away from the tree, they're just going to get a little bit more green. So dabble some of this in. Let's spatter's good. Spatter works as well. I'm just spattering with my regular round brush here, and you can even spritz, sometimes spritzing with your spray bottle can soften up areas. There's lots and lots of ways of painting trees, but I'm really trying to get the feeling of light through here. So I want to make sure that I've got a little bit of contrast right in front of the sun there. Some of these are going to be kind of golden. I feel like everything's wet right now. So try to put in a few more branches and finish this up. Lots of tree trunks in the background as well, because there's this a lot of trees here, so it's dense. We don't see any of the light coming through here, so that means that there's got to be a lot of trees and things in there. The ones that are a little lighter in the background there, they're not going to be as wide as the ones in the foreground because, of course, they're not as close. But you can tell how loosely I'm following my picture. It's really not that similar, but I'm not really worried about that. I'm really trying to get more convey the feeling that the picture's giving me, more so than the duplication of the photo. I might put in a little bit in the field here, a little bit more, create a little bit more perspective here, just to make it look like some of the trees are a little bit closer. One thing to keep in mind, if you're working small, tree branches can be a little more tedious just because of their size. Here, and that tree is actually in front of the sunbeam. So it's okay to, you don't have to lift out every sunbeam so that it shows everything through. You can have some things that are in front of the sunbeam. That's perfectly fine. If I were to take some of this Quin Gold, put a little bit of that in some of the foreground stuff, that's fine too. Kind of brings a little bit more of that sunlit color to the grasses as well. I'll make some of them more green. So oh dear, that was not good. Putting some of the oh well, I put my finger in, I don't even know where I got that from, but I picked it up off my palette, obviously. But the I've got some gold colors in the sunbeams, and then I've got some more greens, darker greens in the in between, like where we did the negative painting there. I don't want to do too much of this. This might just kind of spoil things if I put too much of that on there. I'll make sure I got all of that off my finger. I don't want to put a lot of detail in my foreground. I want to give the illusion of some of these trees. Now you could put some real nice cast shadows on these trees. If I painted sort of this sort of zigzaggy kind of a pattern on the ground here, I could create the illusion of the shadows from the trees in here. And because it's on the ground, all of these things are kind of horizontal, so I can create the illusion of this sun, because they won't look like sun if they don't have any shadows, right? There's sort of the feeling of shadows on the ground, and those will kind of all angle out from the sun the same way that the sunbeams do. All right, so each one of these, if you're making a shadow, will angle away from that light, that beam of light. There we go. Don't want to do too much. I like that salt effect there. So I'm going to start just fading some of that away. I'll just use a damp brush, and as shadows come away from trees, or come away from any object for that matter, the shadows get a little bit lighter. So I'm just dampening my brush and softening some of this as it gets further away from the tree. There, then it just sort of fades, right? So you feel that sun coming onto the ground, and I just need to put a few more tree trunks in here and more foliage. Get the look I'm looking for. And if I feel like I need to lift a little bit more, like some of those highlights and things like that, yeah, I could come in and do a little bit more of that. I just have to be careful, because once I get this really dark color in here and I start trying to soften it up, it can sometimes backfire, and you can get these really muddy highlights in there, so you don't want to do that. It's better to lift it out as much as possible while things are still really light on your paper. So let's see if I can. I don't want to use this brush. I'll use a bigger brush this time, synthetic brush, and I'm just going to lighten and blot some more of this, trying not to hit those darks too much, but see, that's what I mean about filling in too much. You have to be careful when you get the darks on there, especially something staining like a Payne's gray. That could really mess things up. So it's really better to wait until you have, wait and do it with the light colors, and don't proceed with the darks until then. But I think I had a little more darks in order here. Just got to come in and skip around some of those highlights. Try to go quick here. We're an hour and a half in, so it's time to wrap this puppy up. And spattering also really makes a lot of sense to help connect things and give you a little bit of a natural look. A little bit in the foreground's fine. Kind of like, I think I'd like to see some of this go up to the top of my paper. I'm not doing leaf by leaf, I'm doing clusters of foliage. And I think it's important to know the difference. You know, I'm not worried about keeping everything separate here. I'm allowing things to sort of melt together. I can drop in, you know, if I can drop some light colors in here at the same time, I'll get more variations, all that kind of thing. Play around with it. See what works best for you. I'm covered in paint. I got little spatters everywhere, which is fine. So even if I put some these dark branches in front of that, you can still feel the light coming through there. Anyway, you get the idea. So it feels more like there's some light there. And I think I'd like to lose a couple of these, so I'm just going to paint over them. I want that forest to look a little darker, so I'm just going to paint over those with some light color, just to make that feel a little bit more filled in. There, that forest feels a little more dense now, and yeah, so that's essentially what I would be doing with my light in this case. But the sunbeams is lifted, or is negative painting as opposed to lifting out, which is what you might have expected. Connect your trees. They actually touch the ground and become part of the ground. The roots spread out. They're always a little bit anchored to the ground. That always looks a lot better. And yeah, so I could keep coming in with more and more trees in here. As, you know, as dense as you want to make this. If you have a lot of trees in here, you can really fill that in more like what we're seeing in the reference. And you know, you're free to do that, but enjoy it, have some fun with this, and just check to make sure I haven't missed any questions here. Yeah, Janet says, would you make the grasses darker since they are in the foreground? I could make the grasses darker. I don't want them to be as dark or as much contrast as what this area right here. So they are darker relative to what's behind this, but yes, I could absolutely come in and make some of my grasses darker, just not as dark as my focal point. So I could come in with some lighter grasses and darker grasses. I really want to only imply it. I don't want to spell everything out too much for the viewer. I want them to sort of make up their own mind about what's here in the foreground. But yeah, I could, you know, put in some more grasses here and that, you know, just hint at a few of them. I don't think I would make them as dark as this area, though. I wouldn't put as much contrast. That's just me personally. It's not right or wrong, but I don't want to compete with my foreground. What I could do, if I wanted to, is I could make a bit of a vignette effect. So if I dampened this and I put a little bit more sort of dark in this corner, you know, that's a bit of contrast right there. But I could sort of darken that and really feel like I'm sort of framing my painting here with a little bit of darkness in these lower corners. Doesn't have to be really dark, just a little bit of extra dark there, and just doesn't that feel like that's keeping you in this area? There, just hinting at some of this. And even a little spatter into there would be interesting. But now I've lost quite a lot of my salt effect. You could put more salt in there. That would also be an option. But suddenly I have a dry spot there, right? So I've got to dampen that. But if I wanted to put some salt in there, you know, I could do that too. Make that interesting. It won't be as white, but I really wouldn't want that much contrast anyway. But I could put more salt in. Have fun with it. I guess that's the thing. So we should wrap this up. This has gone long enough. You probably have a day to get on with, and so do I. So let me just see. I don't want to miss any questions. Looking for, oh, thank you, Linda. So this isn't really making the grasses darker. I guess it's just kind of making the foreground a little bit darker. But I wanted to show the light coming through there. I obviously don't have as many trees here, so I don't want to make it too dark in the foreground. It's a little bit lighter. All right, I think I got all the questions. All right, so we'll wrap it up. See you next week. Have a great week. Bye.